Hi, Jonathan King 30, and we have reached episode 30 without really leaving the 60s. We've covered my birth in 1944 and all the way up through the 50s and through the 60s, and we've just reached 1970. And one last thing I wanted to do before we move into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 21st century, which has been very dodgy for me, I can tell you, which we'll cover at great length. There are two things that I haven't really gone into that I thought I should do here. Of course, the 60s were known for sex, drugs and rock and roll. Well, we've covered rock and roll from start to finish, but we haven't really gone into the sex or the drugs. As far as drugs were concerned, when I got up to Cambridge, it dawned on me that the two huge areas of life that were really into drugs were universities, and that was Cambridge, Oxford, all the red bricks, all the universities, where people were experimenting with drugs. And of course the music world, mainly the jazz world, but all the greats like Billie Holiday and so on. You've heard all about the heroin overdoses and all the drug problems of the past 20, 30, 40 years. Drugs, of course, as far as I'm concerned, include alcohol and nicotine, and they were very widely spread, and I'd never really smoked or drank either. My father had smoked, and he, of course, died at 42 of arteriosclerosis, which could well have been caused by his smoking and his drinking. My mum smoked and still does, aged 90, and she manages to get through 60 a day, hasn't done her any harm. But I, because of that partly, was off cigarettes and didn't really want to smoke for any reason. But also, I think because I'd thought about it and I came to the conclusion that I adored life. I really got high on what was around me. I didn't want to have to rely on outside stimulants to get me creative or anything else. I wanted to actually be there and be able to cope with whatever was going on in my life in my own way and not to have to rely on anything else. So I basically decided not to do drugs. I didn't smoke or drank either, and I still don't to this day, and now I'm 61. It was perfectly accepted by all my friends at university, in the music industry and everywhere. They just thought I was a little odd because they were all experimenting like mad, but it was not something I did. And sex. Well, sex was something I became aware of at a very early age, and I was very interested. I found sex extremely stimulating and great fun, and my attitude was, as long as the other person wanted to do it, and as long as I wanted to do it, why shouldn't we do it? And I've got to say, from the very early days, I was not influenced by the colour of somebody's skin or their religion or where they came from or their race or their attitude or their gender. In fact, to me, if somebody was a very interesting and attractive person, if I found them attractive physically and mentally, if they found me attractive and they wanted to do something and I suggested it and they said yes please, I couldn't see the harm in doing it. Of course, you have to remember that homosexuality, that's going with somebody of the same gender, was totally illegal and unspoken of in the 60s. It wasn't legalised in Great Britain until the late 60s, when it became legal if you were over 21, although you could go with a member of the opposite sex if you were 16, or they were 16, which struck me as crazy. It then got lowered in the 90s to 18, and finally, 2 days after my arrest, coincidence, it was equalised at 16 in Great Britain. But of course, growing through one's early years, especially when one matured physically and became a teenager, you reach the point where you decided early on if you wanted to do something. And don't forget, at an all-boys school, an all-boys establishment, the only people you could really go with were people of the same gender. It dawned on you that you were doing something that was exciting to you and exciting to them, something that you both enjoyed and you both wanted to try and experiment, and it was illegal. So the main thing was you just didn't tell anyone, and people could get a bit of a reputation if they told too many people. I always remember at school, I went with some of the most butch, most normal, most straight and frighteningly pretending to be straight people, and it always interested me. The people who had no worries at all about their own sexuality were only too happy to do whatever struck them as amusing at the time, and it didn't worry them. The ones who were really quite worried about it themselves would be the ones who sometimes took a bit of persuading, but eventually desperately wanted to do it, and then went around calling everybody else they could see puffs or queers or whatever the current phrase was. It had always amused me that the ones that shouted the loudest and made the most noise about it were the ones who actually had done it, and I knew because I'd done it with them. As I went on in life, obviously, I managed to get quite a lot of girlfriends and got into a situation where I was finding young ladies as interesting and stimulating, both physically and mentally, as young gentlemen. And I have to say my love life over the 61 years I've had has been extremely varied and very pleasurable. I don't regret a moment of it. It's always been with people who wanted to go with me. It's always been with people who enjoyed themselves at the time, I like to think, because if I got the slightest whiff that they didn't, we stopped. And I've got to say that happened a great deal more with girls, who sometimes I found were a bit screwed up about it, possibly because they'd been abused in earlier years, than with guys who were always absolutely dead keen to do anything. That's me on drugs and sex. Now let's move into the 1970s.